The blood-red horizon swallowed the setting sun as Bethany Morrell clutched her baby's blanket to her chest, its familiar scent fading with each passing day. The Wyoming territory of 1878 was unforgiving to a widow, especially one with a fresh grave to tend and no family for 100 miles. "Rest now, my sweet little Sarah," Bethany whispered, her fingers tracing the small wooden cross that marked her 6-month-old daughter's resting place. The fever had come swift and merciless, leaving Bethany alone in the crude homestead her husband had built before pneumonia claimed him the previous winter. The grave was small and bare, exposed to the elements on the windswept hill behind the cabin. Wyoming winters would erase it completely if she couldn't find a way to protect it, but what could she do? A woman alone with limited supplies and no carpentry skills stood little chance against the coming seasons. "Madam, you out here," the deep voice startled Bethany. Her hand went instinctively to the small knife she kept in her apron pocket. Living alone had taught her caution. A tall figure appeared at the crest of the hill. The setting sun silhouetted him, casting his features in shadow, but the distinct shape of a cowboy hat was unmistakable. "State your business," Bethany called, her voice stronger than she felt. "Name's Matthew Quinn, madam. Just passing through, saw your chimney smoke." The man approached slowly, hands visible at his sides. As he drew closer, Bethany could make out a weathered face, perhaps 30 years of age, with kind eyes that seemed to match the gentle way he removed his hat in respect. "I'm sorry to disturb your grieving," he said, glancing at the small cross. "Just wanted to check if you needed anything before I move on." Bethany straightened her back. Pride was all she had left. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn, but we're managing fine." His eyes scanned the property, noting the disrepair of the small cabin, the garden overgrown with weeds, and the solitary cross exposed to the elements. He didn't comment on her use of "we" when clearly she was alone. "That's good to hear." He nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll be making camp down by the creek tonight, heading north in the morning. If you need anything, just holler." He turned to leave, but Bethany found herself calling after him. "Mr. Quinn," he stopped, turning back. "Yes, madam. Do you?" She hesitated, hating to ask but desperate for help. "Do you know how to build a fence?" The next morning, Bethany woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Matthew Quinn unloading wood from his packhorse. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrell," he called, setting down a post. "Hope I didn't wake you too early." "You didn't need to start so soon," she said, approaching cautiously. "Daylight's precious out here." He gestured to the pile of timber. "Found a stand of good pine about a mile back. Should make a fine fence." "I can't pay you, Mr. Quinn," Bethany said bluntly. He met her eyes. "Not asking for payment." "Why would you help a stranger this way?" Suspicion edged her voice. Matthew looked toward the small cross on the hill. "Lost my own little brother when I was young. No child's grave should be left unmarked or unprotected." He paused. "Besides, seems to me you've had your share of hardship, Mrs. Morrell." Bethany nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. "I can offer breakfast at least," she managed finally. "That'd be mighty kind." Over a simple meal of cornmeal mush and coffee, Bethany learned that Matthew Quinn was a cattleman working for the Diamond R Ranch 20 miles north. He was returning from a trip to Cheyenne, where he delivered paperwork for his employer. "What brings you to this homestead, if you don't mind my asking?" Matthew inquired. "Not many women choose to settle in such isolation." Bethany's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "My husband, James, had dreams of building something here. When he died last winter, I couldn't bear to leave." "And the little one?" Matthew asked gently. "Sarah." Bethany's voice cracked. "The fever took her 2 weeks ago. She was only 6 months old." Matthew nodded, his eyes solemn. "I'm mighty sorry for your losses, Mrs. Morrell." After breakfast, Bethany watched as Matthew worked methodically, digging post holes around the small grave. His hands were skilled and confident, measuring each post's placement with careful precision. "May I help?" Bethany asked, setting down a bucket of water she'd brought up from the well. Matthew looked surprised. "It's hard work, madam." "I'm stronger than I look," she replied, "and I'd like to contribute to my daughter's resting place." He nodded, handing her a tool. "Could use help holding these posts steady while I secure them." They worked side by side through the morning. Bethany found comfort in the physical labor, in doing something tangible for Sarah. As the sun climbed higher, she noticed Matthew occasionally stealing glances at her, not in an improper way but with a quiet curiosity. "You've been alone here since your husband passed?" he asked as they paused to drink water. "Yes," Bethany replied. "Neighbors check in when they can, but the closest is the Hendersons, and they're 5 miles east." Matthew frowned. "Winter's coming. It won't be easy on your own." "I'm aware," Bethany said, a touch of defensiveness in her voice. "But this is our home. James and Sarah are both buried here. I won't leave them." "Wasn't suggesting you should," Matthew said quietly. By midday, the fence post stood in place around Sarah's grave. Matthew began attaching the crosspieces, creating a sturdy picket fence that would protect the small grave from animals and weather. "It's beautiful," Bethany said, watching as the fence took shape. Matthew's face softened. "Every little angel deserves a proper resting place." They ate a simple lunch of beans and biscuits. Afterward, Matthew asked about the state of Bethany's supplies for winter. "James had laid in firewood before he fell ill," she explained, "and I've been trying to preserve what I can from the garden, though it's not doing well." Matthew's eyes surveyed the struggling plants. "Soil looks good, just needs proper tending." "I was raised in town," Bethany admitted. "James knew farming, I'm still learning." "I could help with that too before I go," Matthew offered. Bethany felt a flush of embarrassment. "You've done enough already, Mrs. Morrell," Matthew said gently. "Out here, folks help each other. It's how we all survive." That evening, as the fence neared completion, Bethany found herself studying Matthew Quinn more closely. His broad shoulders moved with easy strength as he worked, his face concentrated on the task. There was something reassuring about his presence, something that made the homestead feel less empty. "Will your boss mind you being delayed?" she asked as she brought him fresh water. Matthew shook his head. "Mr. Reynolds is a fair man. He'll understand when I explain." "You don't have to explain anything," Bethany said quickly. "I don't want to cause trouble." Matthew smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "No trouble at all, Mrs. Morrell. Some things are more important than schedules." As the sun began to set, Matthew secured the small gate at the front of the fence. He stepped back, allowing Bethany to see the finished work. The fence stood about 3 feet high, encircling Sarah's grave in a perfect square. The wood was sanded smooth, the craftsmanship impeccable. Matthew had even carved small decorative patterns along the top of each picket. "Oh," Bethany breathed, one hand rising to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes as she stepped forward to touch the smooth wood. "It's perfect." "One last thing," Matthew said, pulling something from his saddlebag. He held out a small jar of white paint. "Thought you might want it painted, to protect the wood and, well, to make it special." The simple kindness was too much. Bethany's composure broke, and she began to weep for Sarah, for James, for the unbearable loneliness of the past months, and for this unexpected compassion from a stranger. Matthew stood awkwardly for a moment, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." "You haven't," Bethany managed through her tears. "It's just, no one has shown such kindness since James died. I'd forgotten what it feels like not to face everything alone." As darkness fell, they sat on the porch of the cabin, a lantern casting soft light between them. Matthew had agreed to stay the night, sleeping in the barn rather than making camp by the creek. "Tell me about your husband," Matthew said, sipping the coffee Bethany had made. Bethany's expression softened with memory. "James was a dreamer. Said this land reminded him of heaven, the way the hills rolled against the sky. He believed we could build something lasting here. Sounds like a good man. He was, stubborn though," she smiled faintly. "Wouldn't see a doctor until the pneumonia was too advanced. Said he couldn't afford to take time away from preparing for winter." Matthew nodded understanding. "And your little one," Sarah, was unexpected. "We'd been married 3 years with no children. Then suddenly there she was." Bethany's voice wavered. "She had James's eyes, I thought. I thought having her would make losing him bearable, that I'd still have a piece of him." "No parent should outlive their child," Matthew said softly. Bethany looked at him curiously. "You speak as though from experience." Matthew's eyes grew distant. "My mother lost 3 before I came along." I remember how she visited their graves every Sunday, no matter the weather. In the lantern light, Bethany noticed a scar along Matthew's jaw that disappeared beneath his collar. "The war?" she asked. He shook his head. "Cattle stampede 2 years back, was lucky to survive." "You've had your share of hardship too, it seems." "Everyone out here has," he replied simply. The next morning, Bethany woke to find Matthew already at work in her neglected garden. He'd pulled weeds and was turning the soil with practiced movements. "You didn't have to do that," she called, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. "Garden needed attention before the first frost," he replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Got some seed packets in my saddlebag that might still take if we plant them today." Bethany asked. Matthew looked suddenly uncertain. "If you'd like the help, that is." Bethany studied him, trying to understand this man who'd appeared from nowhere with such willingness to assist. "Mr. Quinn, why are you really helping me? And don't say it's what neighbors do, because we aren't neighbors." Matthew set down his coffee and wiped his hands on his pants. "Truth is, Mrs. Morrell, I rode past 3 homesteads before yours, all abandoned. Seen too many good people give up on their dreams out here. When I saw you at that grave, standing straight despite everything." Well, seemed like someone worth helping. His honesty disarmed her. "I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on here myself." "One day at a time," Matthew said. "That's all any of us can do." They spent the day working side by side, planting the last vegetables that might survive before winter. Matthew showed Bethany how to protect the seedlings from early frost with canvas coverings. In the afternoon, he repaired loose boards on the cabin and barn, replaced missing roof shingles, and reinforced the chicken coop. Bethany followed him, learning what she could, grateful beyond words for the help. When they painted the fence around Sarah's grave, something shifted between them. The simple act of honoring her child's memory alongside this kind stranger broke down Bethany's carefully maintained walls of isolation. "I think Sarah would have loved this," she said quietly, applying white paint to a picket. "She was always reaching for bright things." Matthew smiled. "All children are drawn to light." As they finished, Matthew produced a small carved wooden flower from his pocket. "Thought this might look nice on the gate." Bethany took the delicate carving, marveling at the detailed petals. "When did you make this?" "Last night, after you went inside." He looked almost embarrassed. "My father taught me, said idle hands were the devil's playground." Bethany carefully attached the wooden flower to the center of the gate. "It's beautiful, thank you." That evening, Bethany insisted Matthew join her for a proper dinner inside the cabin rather than eating on the porch. She'd used precious stores to prepare a chicken stew with dumplings, wanting to show her gratitude. "This is mighty fine cooking, Mrs. Morrell," Matthew said appreciatively. "Please call me Bethany," she said, surprising herself with the invitation to familiarity. "Bethany," he repeated, nodding. "And I'm Matthew." Over dinner, they spoke of practical matters, how Bethany might prepare for winter, what repairs remained critical, where she might find help if needed. But underneath, the pragmatic conversation ran a current of something neither acknowledged, a connection forming, fragile as spring ice. "I should be moving on tomorrow," Matthew said finally, his tone reluctant. "Mr. Reynolds will be expecting me." Bethany nodded, ignoring the sinking feeling in her stomach. "Of course, you've already stayed longer than you planned." "I'd like to come back," Matthew said suddenly, "to check on you, make sure you're managing all right." Hope flared briefly in Bethany's chest before caution tamped it down. "That's not necessary." "Not necessary, perhaps, but I'd like to all the same." His eyes held her steadily. "If that would be acceptable to you." Bethany considered him, this man who had built a fence for her dead child and asked nothing in return. "Yes," she said finally. "That would be acceptable." In the morning, Bethany stood on the porch watching Matthew saddle his horse. The 2 days he'd spent at her homestead had transformed the property the garden tended, the buildings repaired, Sarah's grave protected by a beautiful white fence. "I've left more firewood stacked behind the barn," Matthew said, securing his saddlebags. "Should see you through a month or so." "Thank you," Bethany said, clutching her shawl against the morning chill, "for everything." Matthew turned to face her, his expression serious. "The Hendersons, you said they're 5 miles east," Bethany nodded. If you need help before I return, fire 3 shots in the air. Sound carries in these hills. They'll hear it. When will you return? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Matthew's face softened. First week of each month, if that suits you. That's when I usually make supply runs for the ranch. It was more than Bethany had hoped for. Yes, that would be fine. As Matthew mounted his horse, he tipped his hat to her. Take care, Bethany Morrell, and you, Matthew Quinn. She watched until he disappeared over the eastern ridge, then walked up the hill to Sarah's grave. The white fence gleamed in the morning sunlight, a beacon of beauty and care in the harsh landscape. Bethany knelt before the small cross, her fingers tracing the wooden flower on the gate. I think you sent him to us, little one, she whispered. You and your father both. October arrived with its golden light and crisp mornings. Bethany threw herself into preparations for winter, determined to be more self-sufficient before Matthew's return. She harvested the vegetables they had planted, preserved what she could, and practiced the repairs he had taught her. Each day, she visited Sarah's grave, the white fence a constant reminder that she was not entirely alone in the world. Sometimes, she found herself talking to Matthew in her mind, telling him about her small triumphs successfully patching a leak, bartering eggs for flour with a passing trader, frightening off a coyote that had been eyeing her chickens. When the first week of November arrived, Bethany found herself watching the eastern ridge. On the third day, her heart leapt at the sight of a rider appearing against the sky. Matthew dismounted before she could reach the porch, his face breaking into a smile that warmed Bethany more than she cared to admit. You're still here, he said, as if he'd half expected to find the homestead abandoned. I am, she replied. And you came back. Said I would, didn't I? He had brought supplies: coffee, sugar, flour, and a bolt of warm flannel fabric. For winter nightgowns, he explained, slightly embarrassed. The ranch cook's wife suggested it might be useful. Bethany accepted the gifts, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. I can't repay you for all this. Not looking for repayment. Matthew glanced around the property, nodding with approval at what he saw. You've been busy. I had a good teacher, Bethany said. Over the next 2 days, Matthew helped Bethany prepare the homestead for winter in earnest. They banked soil against the north side of the cabin for insulation, repaired the stone chimney, and split enough firewood to last through the harshest months. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the comfortable silence between them occasionally broken by conversation. Bethany found herself telling Matthew stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of meeting James at a church social, of their journey west. Matthew spoke of his years working cattle, of the beauty he'd seen in the untamed territories, of his dream to someday have land of his own. Why haven't you settled down? Bethany asked on his last evening before departing. A man with your skills could build a fine homestead. Matthew stared into the fire. Never found the right reason, I suppose. The right reason or the right person? Bethany asked, then flushed at her boldness. Matthew's eyes met hers across the firelight. Perhaps both. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Matthew cleared his throat and stood. Better get some rest, long ride tomorrow. Before he left the next morning, Matthew helped Bethany visit Sarah's grave. The fence had weathered its first month beautifully, the white paint still bright against the increasingly barren landscape. I was thinking, Matthew said hesitantly, come spring we might plant some flowers around the fence. Brighten it up. The casual "we" sent a flutter through Bethany's chest. I'd like that. As he mounted to leave, Matthew seemed reluctant. Winter storms might make it hard to visit in December, he warned. If I don't make it, don't think I've forgotten my promise. I understand, Bethany assured him, though the thought of not seeing him for months caused an ache she hadn't expected. You have enough supplies? He asked for the third time that morning. More than enough, she promised. I'll be fine, Matthew. He nodded, then surprised her by reaching down to briefly squeeze her hand. Until spring then, if not before. December brought the first heavy snows, transforming the Wyoming landscape into a pristine white expanse. Bethany settled into a routine of survival, tending her chickens, maintaining the cabin, rationing her supplies carefully. Each day, no matter the weather, she made the trek up the hill to Sarah's grave, the white fence a stark contrast against the snow-covered ground. As Matthew had predicted, no riders appeared on the eastern ridge. The snow was too deep, the journey too treacherous. Bethany told herself she wasn't disappointed, that she had known this would be the case. Still, she found herself watching the horizon more often than was practical. Christmas came and went, a quiet day marked only by Bethany reading her Bible by the fire and placing a small carved wooden horse, a gift James had made for Sarah's first Christmas, inside the fenced grave area. January brought bitter cold and isolation deeper than Bethany had ever experienced. The silence of the snow-covered homestead was broken only by the occasional howl of distant wolves. She began talking aloud to herself, to Sarah, to James, just to hear a human voice. In February, a blizzard raged for 3 days, confining Bethany to the cabin. When it finally subsided, she emerged to find drifts taller than herself surrounding the building. It took hours to dig a path to the barn and chicken coop. When she finally made her way up the hill to Sarah's grave, her heart sank. The fence was nearly buried in snow, only the tops of the pickets visible. Frantically, Bethany began digging with her bare hands, desperate to uncover the grave marker. "No, no, no," she muttered, her fingers numbing as she scraped away snow. "I promised I'd take care of you, Sarah." A sharp pain shot through her hand as she struck something beneath the snow. Pulling back her glove, she saw blood welling from a deep cut across her palm. Dizzy suddenly, Bethany sat back in the snow, clutching her injured hand. "Foolish," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "What good are you to Sarah if you freeze to death up here?" Back in the cabin, Bethany bandaged her hand as best she could, but by morning, angry red streaks were spreading up her wrist. Fever followed, and with it, delirious visions, James calling to her from the doorway. Sarah crying in a crib that no longer existed, Matthew riding through a snowstorm toward her. In moments of clarity, Bethany knew she needed help, but the nearest neighbor was miles away, and she could barely stand. On the 3rd day of fever, using the last of her strength, Bethany dragged herself to the door, took her husband's rifle from above the mantel, and fired 3 shots into the air. The effort exhausted her. She collapsed on the cabin floor, darkness claiming her consciousness. Bethany dreamed of warmth, of gentle hands, of a deep voice calling her name with increasing urgency. She dreamed of being carried through snow, of broth spooned between her lips, of a cool cloth on her forehead. When she finally opened her eyes, the cabin was dim, lit only by the glow of a banked fire. For a moment, Bethany thought she was still dreaming. Matthew Quinn sat in a chair beside her bed, his head drooping in sleep, his hand resting near hers on the quilt. "Matthew." Her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. He startled awake, relief flooding his features. "Bethany, thank God." "How?" She couldn't form more words, her throat painfully dry. Matthew helped her sip water before explaining. "Was making a supply run to the southern properties when I heard gunshots. Found you unconscious, burning with fever." His voice tightened. "That was 2 days ago." 2 days. Bethany tried to sit up but fell back weakly. "Easy now," Matthew cautioned. "That infection nearly took you, Mrs. Henderson's been by with medicines. She'll be glad to know you're awake." Bethany looked down at her bandaged hand, then back at Matthew's exhausted face. "You've been here the whole time, couldn't leave you," he said simply. "Not like this." Tears filled Bethany's eyes. "Sarah's grave is fine," Matthew assured her. "I cleared the snow, checked that everything was intact. The fence held strong, just like I built it to do." Relief washed through Bethany, followed by a surge of emotion she couldn't name. "Why did you come back, in winter, through the snow?" Matthew's eyes held her steadily. "Because you were here." Recovery was slow. The infection had weakened Bethany considerably, and February's harsh weather made regaining strength difficult. Matthew stayed, moving between the barn and cabin, caring for the livestock, keeping fires burning, preparing simple meals that Bethany could manage. Mrs. Henderson, a sturdy woman in her 50s, visited twice more, bringing medicines and checking Bethany's wound. On her second visit, she pulled Matthew aside for a conversation Bethany couldn't hear. Whatever was said left Matthew looking thoughtful. "What did Mrs. Henderson want?" Bethany asked when they were alone again. Matthew busied himself stoking the fire. "Just concerned about propriety." A single man staying with a widow and all. Bethany's cheeks flushed. In her illness, she hadn't considered how their situation might appear to others. "Perhaps you should return to the ranch," she said reluctantly. "Now that I'm recovering." Matthew turned to face her. "Is that what you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Bethany looked at this man who had built her child's fence, who had returned through winter storms to check on her, who had possibly saved her life. "No," she admitted quietly. "It isn't." Matthew's expression softened. "The Hendersons have invited you to stay with them until spring. Mrs. Henderson thinks the company would do you good, and they have a proper guest room." "And what do you think?" Bethany asked. "I think you're strong enough to decide what's best for yourself." Matthew sat beside her bed. "But I also think no one should face Wyoming winters alone if they don't have to." Bethany considered her options. The Hendersons were good people, and their home would certainly be more comfortable than her struggling homestead. But something in her rebelled at the idea of leaving, even temporarily. "This is my home," she said finally. "James and Sarah are here, I won't leave them." Matthew nodded, unsurprised. "Then I'll speak to Mr. Henderson about checking in on you regularly. And I'll stay another week until you're stronger." "What about your job?" Sent word to Mr. Reynolds explaining the situation. He's a family man himself, he understands the situation. The words hung between them, undefined yet significant. March arrived with the first hints of thaw, snow retreating from south-facing slopes, revealing patches of earth that had been hidden for months. Bethany's strength returned gradually. With Matthew's help, she began taking short walks outside, rebuilding her endurance. One clear afternoon, they visited Sarah's grave together. The fence stood intact, protecting the small cross just as Matthew had intended. Bethany placed a hand on the gate, her heart full of gratitude. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, watching her. "About what you said regarding Sarah sending me here." Bethany turned to him, surprised. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you've told me," he said quietly. A warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine spread through Bethany's chest. "And what do you think?" "About Sarah sending you, I think," Matthew said carefully, "that some meetings aren't chance. That perhaps your Sarah and my little brother had a hand in bringing us together." "To build a fence?" Bethany asked, her voice soft. Matthew shook his head. "To build something more lasting, perhaps." The implication of his words hung in the crisp air between them. Bethany studied his face, the earnest eyes, the weathered lines that spoke of outdoor life, the gentle set of his mouth. "Matthew," she began, uncertain how to proceed, "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "Neither am I exactly," he admitted with a small smile. "Just know that these past months coming here, knowing you were waiting, it's given me something to look forward to in a way I haven't experienced before." Bethany's heart quickened. "I've looked forward to your visits too. Even when they involve fence building and garden digging," he teased gently. "Especially then," she replied, surprising herself with her candor. They stood in companionable silence, watching as clouds cast moving shadows across the distant hills. Finally, Matthew spoke again, his voice hesitant. "I'll be moving on soon. Mr. Reynolds can't spare me much longer." Though Bethany had known this moment would come, the announcement still fell heavily between them. "Of course, you've stayed far longer than you intended. But I'd like to continue visiting," Matthew said quickly. "If that would be welcome." "It would," Bethany assured him. "Very much so." Matthew nodded, seeming relieved. Then, with careful movements, he reached for her hand, taking it gently in his. The simple contact sent a current through Bethany that both startled and pleased her. "There's something else," Matthew said, his voice low. "Something I've been wanting to ask." Bethany waited, her pulse quickening. "The ranch where I work, Mr. Reynolds is selling some of his northern pastureland, good grazing with a creek running through it. It's about 5 miles from here." "You're thinking of buying it?" Bethany asked, beginning to understand. Matthew nodded. "Been saving for my own place for years. The timing seems right." "That's wonderful," Bethany said sincerely. "You'd make a fine rancher on your own." "Thing is," Matthew continued, his grip on her hand tightening slightly, 5 miles isn't so far. Close enough to be neighbors, close enough to help each other when needed." The implication hung between them, neither quite ready to voice what was developing. "I'd like that," Bethany said finally. "Being neighbors." Matthew's smile warmed her more than the spring sunshine. So would I, Bethany Morrell, so would I. The following week passed too quickly. Matthew completed the last critical repairs to the homestead, ensuring everything was secure for the coming spring rains. Each evening they sat together by the fire, their conversations growing deeper, more personal. Bethany learned of Matthew's childhood in Missouri, his parents' early deaths, his years riding with cattle drives before settling at the Diamond R Ranch. Matthew listened as Bethany spoke of her life in Pennsylvania, her courtship with James, the dreams they'd shared for their future in Wyoming. Neither spoke directly of what was developing between them, but something had shifted, a possibility that brightened the horizon like the promise of dawn. The morning of Matthew's departure arrived with a gentle rain that greened the hills overnight. Bethany stood on the porch, watching as he saddled his horse and secured his few belongings. "The Hendersons said they'll check on you every few days," Matthew said, tightening a strap. "And I've spoken to Mr. Reynolds about that northern pasture. He's agreeable to terms. So you'll be a landowner soon," Bethany said, smiling despite the heaviness in her heart at his leaving, "if all goes well." Matthew turned to face her, his expression serious. "Bethany, I want you to know something before I go." She waited, her hands clasped tightly before her. "When I first rode past your homestead and saw you at that grave, I stopped because it seemed the decent thing to do. I built that fence because I understood your grief." Matthew took a step closer. "But I kept coming back because of you, because something in me recognized something in you." Bethany's breath caught. "Matthew, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know it's soon. I know you're still healing in many ways. I just wanted you to know that whatever happens with that land purchase, whether we end up neighbors or not, I intend to remain in your life if you'll allow it." The sincerity in his voice moved Bethany deeply. This wasn't a declaration of love, not yet, but a promise of possibility, a commitment to whatever might grow between them. "I would like that very much," she said softly, "to have you remain in my life." Relief washed over Matthew's features. Gently, he reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both respectful and tender. "I'll return within the month," he promised. "Sooner if I can manage it." As Matthew mounted his horse, the rain subsided, allowing weak sunshine to break through the clouds. Bethany watched him ride away, but this time without the ache of uncertainty. He would return. Of this, she was certain. The weeks that followed saw a transformation of the landscape as spring took firm hold. Bethany threw herself into preparing the garden Matthew had helped restore, planting the seeds they had discussed during winter evenings. Each day, she visited Sarah's grave, the white fence now surrounded by the first tentative spring wildflowers. True to his word, Matthew returned 3 weeks later, his face alight with news. The land purchase was proceeding. Mr. Reynolds had accepted his offer, and by summer, Matthew would begin building his own ranch. 5 miles isn't so far," Bethany said, echoing his earlier words as they walked the boundaries of her property. "Close enough to be neighborly," Matthew agreed, his smile suggesting deeper meaning. Their time together assumed a comfortable rhythm, Matthew visiting every few weeks, staying for 2 or 3 days, helping with larger projects before returning to his duties at Diamond R. With each visit, the bond between them strengthened, a fragile tenderness blossoming into something more substantial. By late May, the garden Bethany and Matthew had tended together burst with new growth. The cabin, repaired and weathertight, looked more like a home than it had since James's death. Most notably transformed was Sarah's grave, where Matthew had helped Bethany plant a circle of bright flowers around the white fence, creating a garden of remembrance that could be seen from the cabin porch. On a warm June evening, they sat on that porch, watching as fireflies began to illuminate the gathering dusk. Matthew had spent the day helping Bethany repair the chicken coop, and comfortable exhaustion settled between them. "I signed the final papers yesterday," Matthew said, breaking their companionable silence. "The northern pasture is officially mine. Congratulations," Bethany said warmly. "When will you start building?" "Next month, if all goes well." "Mr. Reynolds has given me leave to begin while still working for him." Bethany smiled at his obvious excitement. "You'll be a fine rancher, Matthew Quinn." "Hope so." He gazed out at the darkening landscape, Been thinking about what to call it, your ranch. What names have you considered? Matthew looked slightly embarrassed, was thinking maybe White Fence Ranch if that wouldn't trouble you. The suggestion caught Bethany by surprise, emotion welling up unexpectedly. Because of Sarah's fence, Matthew nodded. That fence brought me here, brought us together in a way. Seems fitting to honor that. Impulsively, Bethany reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. I think it's perfect. They sat in silence, hands linked, as darkness settled fully over the homestead. The simple contact felt significant, a boundary crossed, an acknowledgement of deepening feelings. Bethany, Matthew said finally, his voice low, I've been wanting to ask you something. Her heart quickened. Yes. Would you consider, he paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. That is, would it be presumptuous of me to call on you? Properly, I mean. Bethany couldn't help smiling at his formal phrasing. Call on me, like a suitor? Matthew's embarrassment was visible even in the dim light. Yes, like a suitor. Matthew Quinn, Bethany said gently, you've been calling on me for months. You built my daughter's fence. You saved my life. You've repaired my home and tended my garden. That's different, he insisted. That was being neighborly. Was it? Bethany challenged softly. Is that all it was? Matthew's eyes held hers in the gathering darkness. No, he admitted quietly. It wasn't just being neighborly, not for a long time now. Something shifted between them, a current of possibility becoming more tangible. Bethany felt herself drawn toward him, the months of growing affection crystallizing into something she could no longer deny. Then yes, she whispered. I would very much like you to call on me, properly. The smile that spread across Matthew's face was like sunrise. Gently, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made Bethany's heart swell. Thank you, he said simply. That night, after Matthew had retired to the barn where he always insisted on sleeping to maintain propriety, Bethany stood on the porch gazing up at the star-filled Wyoming sky. For the first time since losing James and Sarah, the future didn't loom as an empty expanse to be endured. Instead, it sparkled with possibility. I think you'd approve, she whispered, knowing somehow that James would understand. He's a good man, the kind of man you'd have respected. As summer progressed, Matthew divided his time between his duties at Diamond R, preparing his new land and visiting Bethany. Their courtship proceeded with the careful deliberation of two people who had known loss and understood the preciousness of new beginnings. Word spread through the scattered community about the widow Morrell and the Diamond R cowboy who was building his own ranch. Mrs. Henderson, during her regular visits, made no secret of her approval. That Quinn fellow is solid as they come, she told Bethany one afternoon as they put up preserves. Not the type to make promises lightly. We're taking things slowly, Bethany explained, not wanting to presume too much despite the deepening of her feelings for Matthew. Mrs. Henderson snorted good-naturedly. Slow is fine, dear, but don't drag your feet when Providence sends a blessing your way. By August, the framework of Matthew's ranch house stood on his newly acquired land. Bethany rode over to see it one Sunday afternoon, marveling at how much he had accomplished in his spare time. It's not much yet, Matthew said as he showed her the structure, but it will be sturdy and warm come winter. It's wonderful, Bethany assured him, imagining the home it would become. How many head of cattle will you start with? Mr. Reynolds is letting me have 10 as part of my final payment, plus my own horses. Matthew hesitated. It's enough to start, but it will be a lean first year or two. All beginnings are, Bethany said softly, remembering her own first difficult months on the homestead with James. Matthew's eyes held hers. Some beginnings are worth any hardship. The directness of his gaze made Bethany's cheeks warm. More and more frequently, Matthew's words carried deeper meanings, hinting at a future neither had explicitly discussed. That evening, as they rode back to Bethany's homestead, a comfortable silence settled between them. The August sun painted the hills gold and amber, the beauty of the Wyoming landscape spread before them in breathtaking panorama. I can see why James chose this place, Matthew said as they crested a rise overlooking both properties. It is a bit like heaven. Bethany nodded, throat tight with emotion. He always said so. Matthew reined his horse closer to hers. Bethany, there's something I need to say. Her heart quickened at his serious tone. "What is it?" "I want you to know that I understand James will always have a place in your heart, as will Sarah." Matthew's voice was gentle but firm. "I would never ask you to forget them or minimize what they meant to you." Tears filled Bethany's eyes at his understanding. "Thank you for that. But I also want you to know," Matthew continued, his voice deepening with emotion, "that my feelings for you have grown into something I never expected to find out here, something I treasure more than any land or cattle." The declaration hung between them, honest and unadorned. Bethany felt a surge of affection so strong it momentarily robbed her of speech. "Matthew," she finally managed, "I feel the same way." His smile was radiant in the golden evening light. Carefully, he reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "I'm glad to hear it." September brought the harvest and the completion of Matthew's ranch house. The small community gathered for a house raising to finish the barn, bringing food and good wishes for the new venture. Bethany watched with pride as Matthew directed the work, his natural leadership evident in how the other men respected his judgment. "Your young man has built himself a fine place," Mrs. Henderson commented as she and Bethany served lemonade to the workers. "Though it seems mighty big for just one person." Bethany flushed at the older woman's knowing look, but made no reply. As autumn painted the landscape in rich hues of red and gold, Matthew's visits to Bethany's homestead took on a new dimension of purpose. Often, he brought small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, seeds for next year's garden, a length of blue ribbon that matched her eyes. One crisp October day, exactly 1 year after Matthew had first appeared on Bethany's homestead, they visited Sarah's grave together. The white fence gleamed in the autumn sunlight, the flowers they had planted now fading with the season but still beautiful in their way. "I can't believe it's been a year," Bethany said, adjusting a loose board on the fence. "So much has changed." Matthew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "When I built this fence, I never imagined where it would lead." They stood side by side, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. After a respectful silence, Matthew turned to face Bethany. "I brought something for Sarah," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small carved wooden cross, more elaborately detailed than the simple one that currently marked the grave. "I thought perhaps a more permanent marker." Bethany took the cross, running her fingers over the intricate carvings, tiny flowers, and delicate vines surrounding Sarah's name and dates. "It's beautiful, Matthew. Thank you." Together, they replaced the weathered marker with Matthew's creation, the new cross standing proudly within the protection of the white fence. As they walked back toward the cabin, Matthew seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous. When they reached the porch steps, he stopped, turning to face Bethany. "There's something else I wanted to give you today," he said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Another gift. Matthew, you're too generous. Not a gift exactly." He drew a deep breath. "More of a question." Bethany's heart began to race as Matthew took her hands in his. "Bethany Morrell," he began, his eyes holding her steadily, "this past year has shown me what it means to truly care for someone, to want their happiness above my own, to build a life that includes them in every plan and dream." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes as she recognized where his words were leading. "I know we've both experienced loss," Matthew continued. "We both carry memories that will always be part of us, but I believe there's room in our hearts for new joy, new memories." Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands. "I love you, Bethany. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of joining our two homes, our two lives?" Though Bethany had begun to hope for this moment, the reality of it overwhelmed her. For a heartbeat, she thought of James, of the life they had planned together. But there was no conflict in her heart, only a deep certainty that this new love didn't diminish the old, but honored it. "Yes," she whispered, joy spilling over in tears. "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." Matthew rose, gathering her into his arms with gentle reverence. Their first kiss was tender, a promise of the life they would build together. They were married in November, a simple ceremony in the Hendersons' parlor with the scattered neighbors in attendance. Bethany wore a dress of deep blue that Matthew said matched her eyes, with a sprig of dried wildflowers from Sarah's fence in her hair. After the ceremony, before joining their small wedding supper, the newlyweds rode to Bethany's homestead. Together, they walked up the hill to where James and Sarah were buried, Matthew's arm supportive around his new wife's waist. "I wanted to tell them," Bethany explained as they stood before the graves. "To let them know I'm not abandoning them, even though I'll be living at our ranch now." Matthew nodded understanding. "We'll visit often, and come spring, we'll plant new flowers around the fence." Bethany leaned against her husband's strong shoulder. "James would have liked you," she said quietly. "He always said a measure of a man was in how he treated those who couldn't repay him." "Like building a fence for a child's grave?" Matthew asked softly. "Exactly like that." Bethany turned in his arms, her expression serious. "That fence brought us together, Matthew. It was the beginning of everything." "Then I'm grateful for it," he replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "And for the little angel who brought me to her mother." Spring of 1880 arrived with new promise for the Quinn ranch. The winter had been challenging but manageable, the newlyweds finding joy in building their life together. Matthew's cattle herd had increased by 7 calves, a hopeful sign for the ranch's future. One warm May morning, Bethany stood on the porch of their ranch house, a letter in her hand and tears in her eyes. Matthew, returning from checking the herd, saw her expression and quickened his steps. "What is it?" he asked, concern evident. "Bad news," Bethany shook her head, unable to speak. Instead, she handed him the letter from Dr. Carson in town. Matthew scanned it quickly, his eyes widening as he reached the conclusion. "You're certain?" he asked, voice hushed with wonder. Bethany nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I went in for that dizziness. We're going to have a baby, Matthew, in November." Matthew whooped with joy, lifting Bethany carefully in his arms and spinning her around. "A baby," he exclaimed, "our baby." The shared joy of that moment bound them even closer, healing old wounds and strengthening their bond. As Bethany's pregnancy progressed, they made regular visits to the homestead, ensuring the buildings remained in good repair and tending the graves on the hill. The white fence around Sarah's resting place became even more meaningful as they prepared for the new life that would join their family. "I want our child to know about Sarah," Bethany told Matthew one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "And about James. They're part of our story." "Of course," Matthew agreed, his hand gentle on her growing belly. "We'll tell him or her about the sister who watches from heaven, about the brave mother who endured so much, about the fence that brought us together." On a crisp November day, with the first dusting of snow on the distant mountains, Bethany gave birth to a healthy baby girl. As she placed the infant in Matthew's arms, his eyes shining with tears, Bethany felt a circle completing, not erasing the past, but building upon it to create something beautiful and new. "What shall we call her?" Matthew asked, gazing in wonder at his daughter's tiny features. Bethany smiled, certain of the name. "Hope," she said softly, "because that's what she represents for us, and what her sister's fence gave us when we needed it most." The following spring, Matthew and Bethany stood on the hill behind the old homestead, now maintained as part of their expanded ranch. Matthew carried little Hope, bundled warmly against the spring breeze. Bethany knelt beside Sarah's grave, carefully planting new flowers around the white fence that had weathered another winter. "Look, Hope," Matthew said, holding their daughter where she could see the bright blooms. "These are for your big sister." Bethany stood, brushing soil from her hands, and joined her husband and daughter. Together, the family of 3 with 2 watching over them from above gazed at the white fence that had brought them together, that had transformed grief into new beginnings, that had created a family where once there had been only loneliness. "The fence is holding strong," Matthew observed, his arm around Bethany's waist. "Like us," Bethany replied, leaning into his embrace. "Like our family." As they turned to walk back to their horses, Bethany paused for one last look at the white fence gleaming in the spring sunshine. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, a cowboy building a fence around a baby's grave with his own hands, had grown into something neither could have imagined. A love that healed past wounds, a family forged from shared grief and joy, a future bright with promise. And watching over it all, protected by the white fence built with loving hands, the small cross that had brought them together.